Okay, welcome everyone. Ryan, will you let people in the waiting room if they join? Thank you for joining us on this Thursday afternoon. We're going to talk about educational stability for students in foster care. Next slide. We have a lot of us here presenting today, and so we're going to each introduce ourselves, and I will start. My name is Peggy Carlson, she, her pronouns, and I work at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, as the Education Program Administrator. And I also want to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional lands of the Cowlitz tribe. And I will pass it off to Shanna.
Good afternoon, Shanna McBride, and I am the statewide education program manager for kids in foster care for DCYF. I use she, her pronouns, and I am here today living and working on the Squaxin tribal land. Thanks for being here. And I'll pass it on to Debbie Gomi.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debbie Gomi. I work in Region 3 of DCYF, which is Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom, Island, and San Juan counties. I'm the educational program consultant for kids in this region. Is Dawn or?
So we'll have Dawn and Heidi joining us a little later. So we'll go ahead and skip to Stacy.
Good afternoon. I am Stacy Clem, she, her pronouns, and I am the foster care program specialist at OSPI.
And I also want to mention that we have Savannah with us today, also from OSPI, Savannah Cavaletto, and she is running our show today, doing the slides. So thanks, Savannah. Next slide.
Were we doing a specific welcome or just?
Yeah, let's go. I do want to hear, I want to see who's in the room. And since we have not a huge group, it would be great if people can just type into the chat box. Let's do your name, what your role is, and where in the state you're joining us from. Hi, Gabriel, Skylar. Small group today. There's Ebony. Welcome, welcome.
Pierce County, Marysville.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so we just wanted to let you know kind of our agenda today. We'll be walking through the federal and state law. We'll be walking through data and ways that you have where you can be a support in a student's case in foster care. So we'll be going through best interest determination. We'll also be going through resources and post-secondary options. But what we really want you to know from this slide is that this is a long 3 hours and there will be breaks. So we're shooting for breaks around 2:10 and around 3. So you will have a chance to get up and walk around, get a snack. But of course, we're all adults, so feel free to do that throughout any time. Also, we do have a small group. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to put those in the chat. We'll be watching that. And we'll probably do questions kind of at the end of each section. So feel free to be asking questions throughout. Thank you.
Next slide. All right, so you'll notice that today our main focus is on educational stability for students in foster care. And we're going to look at the federal law and the state laws that we have around educational stability. But why is this important? And there's a lot of research that shows that students who change school placements mid-year they lose academic progress every time they switch schools. And we know that students in foster care change schools frequently. And so Shanna's going to be showing some data later on that really shows what happens with that the educational outcomes for students in foster care are much lower than their peers. And a lot of that has to do with this changing schools, moving schools. And if you think about it, what happens if they don't change schools? What if they get to stay in the school where they're going? So they go into foster care or change placements, but they get to stay at the school where they have friends and their classmates. They have a teacher who knows them and knows what their strengths are and knows where they may need a little extra support. They know the schedule, they know the layout of the school, they know where the lunchroom is. Like there's so many factors that make it so much easier. And so it makes a lot of sense that if we really promote this educational stability, we're going to give these kids a better chance at academic success. Go ahead, next slide. So before we get started on all the laws, we all feel like it's really important to hear from kids. And so we wanted to play this short video of young people talking about their school experience. And you can go ahead and play it, Savannah.
When I was younger, I wanted to be a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer, a singer. I wanted to be somebody successful. Then I entered the foster care system when I was 14 years old. A lot of what I wanted to be didn't matter anymore.
Unstable, changing, and alone.
Where I learned absolutely nothing.
I didn't have traditional schooling. A lot of people don't understand that foster kids travel from home to home and placement to placement, residential to residential. And unfortunately, even though school should be the #1 priority, it's not.
11 schools.
I attended 12 schools.
Moving from school to school really affected my grades as well. I went from a B average to a low C average.
I lived in 45 different placements, and I went to over 23 different schools.
While I was in foster care, I went to about like 10 schools.
I've been in 3 different elementary schools, 4 different middle schools, and countless high schools in both Idaho and Washington.
Inadequate. Unfinished.
And I say hard because I had to wear this mask and pretend that everything is okay. Like,
Emotionally tasking and difficult to be able to juggle that at an age where I wasn't fully developed.
Hard, a struggle.
Eye-opening.
Self-motivated.
I got threatened with expulsion twice because I was missing so many excused days, but I couldn't miss my court hearings.
Misunderstood because foster youth tend to come with a negative label, and because of that, I don't think that teachers and guidance counselors took the time to truly get to know me.
I'm still trying to continue my education.
I went to like 3 schools in years, like 3 schools. Each school couldn't pass off the paperwork.
So insane.
I did not have a high school diploma. I had a certificate of attendance.
I say unstable.
While I was in Rikers Island, I graduated. Got my GED.
Really hard, and it's really unstable. You get to this line where it's either you have to say that you're a foster youth to avoid getting zeros and on your missed tests and missed homework assignments, or you try to keep whatever privacy you have left and just take the zeros.
I'd never graduated high school. I stopped going, to be honest. It's something that's going to affect me for the rest of my life.
The statistics are really stacked against us.
Stacy, did you want to do the
I
Menti?
do. So I'm going to paste a link in the chat. And if you would click on that and go into our Menti meter and answer the question I have posted. Let me know if you have any trouble getting in. Peggy, did you try it? Were you able to get in? We are getting a few response. At school, in court, through court reports, all at FTDM meetings, team meetings. All right, looks like we had a few good responses there.
Okay, let's look at the data.
For those that weren't able to get into the Mentimeter, what was the question that you asked?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me share my screen real quick. Here it is. Can you guys see it? Yeah.
Yes.
So in what settings can you impact education in your role as an advocate? Parent-teacher conferences is a new one. IEP meetings, great. I was hoping someone would say that. IEP 405s, but IEPs I think meant 504s. Communicating my concerns, always important. So thank you for sharing. Now I do not have how to get out of here.
I think you have to stop sharing and then Savannah can go back to the PowerPoint.
My stop share button. There we go. It's
Woo.
didn't have a
Go
stop
ahead
share
and-
button.
Go ahead and go to the next slide, Savannah.
We're trying to get all tricky here and get folks involved, so be patient with us and thank you for your grace. Talking about the next few slides are on data, and data is really important because it just tells us the landscape that we're working within. There is our kids in foster care disproportionately who are students of color are more often in foster care. And then as we start drilling down to some of the other data points, the disproportionality just kind of keeps raising. Total, let's see, this one is by race and Hispanic origin. So looking at this one, and pretty much all races other than Caucasian are disproportionately represented in the foster care system. So something to be aware of. Next slide. This is so children in foster care by the age group. So I did the math on this one earlier real quick, and about 56% of our kids in foster care are school age. So really being in tune and supportive of education is very important, as well as early learning and getting students prepared, our younger students. Next. Okay. So here's really where the rubber meets the road, is that our kids in foster care graduate at less than 50% compared to their peers. And as you can see through the years, non-foster care students, they have, a little bit of rise throughout the years, and ours just kind of, it doesn't, one year it gets to 50, but it goes up and down. And it's, that's quite a bit lower than our students in non-foster care. And a lot of that, I think, as the students in the video we just watched, is placement moves, not having the right support services, having gaps, having unresolved trauma that looks like challenging behaviors, which results in discipline unnecessarily, possibly. So really as advocates, your places, you know, all the places that you said you could have impact are absolutely on track. You get to be a voice for that youth. Often, you know, and have been connected with that youth and that family for longer than our social workers. There's high rate of turnover for our social workers. You know them more than the school folks may. And so your voice of the students' strengths, challenges, barriers you're seeing are really, they're invaluable. So, so one, thank you for being here. And two, those are all great places you can be, have effect. Next slide. Okay. So here's the discipline rates. And this is the piece, if you look at the first part is foster care rates of discipline. The second portion, the black bar, is non-foster care students. And look at the rates for students who have been excluded for school. This is what percent of students are excluded in response to behavior violation. I really, I think that words and language are really important. And I think sometimes changing, I would almost put in here response to a trauma impact. So really, you know, looking at how trauma can look like so many other things. It can look like anxiety. When you're at a school meeting, when you're at a department meeting with DCYF, you have an opportunity, as well as the rest of the team too, when labeling words start getting used, I really use that as a time to pause and say, hey, can we talk a little bit more about that? You know, saying the student's lazy or they're being defiant. What behavior do we or need do you think that behavior is needing? What does that really look like? Because so often it's really easy to just label students. It's quick, easy. There's so much going on. I think it's really important to stop and pause. Language is really, really important. Next slide. Percentage. So on every outcome that's measured through OSPI, ERDC, some of the agencies that look at the student data, our students in foster care are far below their peers. And this is over 20% below their peers who are not in foster care. So this one's for English language. Math is very similar. Next slide, I believe, is attendance. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, no. Okay, percent of students with mobility. A lot of this, look at our students moving at 17.2% over our non-foster care at 4.2. 4.2, you know, students move. A parent gets a new job. They move into a different house, a different neighborhood. But 17.2%, those are our kids going, like was in the video, from foster placement to foster placement. And what we would like to see is, one, of course, we'd like to see students moving less foster homes, but we'd like to see that when they're moving foster homes, they get to stay in their same school, that there's some stability that they get to hold on to. And we can help them as supports and as team members to really advocate for that stability. Next data slide, please. So this is percent of students with regular attendance. 70%, it went up. You'll see in 2019, 2020, attendance for our students in foster care went up. A lot of us talking about that really feel that it has to do with that learning was online, that there were a lot of opportunities and different supports for students. While we heard that students were not getting their needs met through remote and online learning, I think we also learned some lessons about how we can be flexible in supporting students. When students moved during the pandemic, because school was online and remote, they did not necessarily have to change schools with that home placement. And we will be talking about best interest determination and the laws and processes in place to keep students in their same school. But we did see that we could sustain and support students in their same school. And it's something that we'll talk about in ways that we can still do that today as we're moving out of the pandemic and as folks are doing school more in person. Next slide. Okay. So this is again in the chat because we have a small group. Please feel free to either take yourself off mute or put in the chat kind of what stands out to you. Was there anything surprising in the data?
Actually, we have a Mentimeter in there.
Oh, we do. Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Forget about
So
these little things.
Savannah, if you'll let me share my screen, we will, I'll put it up so we can all watch the responses as they come in. Can you guys see the screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what data stands out to you? Does anything surprise you? Go ahead and fill that out for us.
I forgot to also, I kind of skipped over, but mentioning the sources of the data. So OSPI reports on data and it's public on their report card on their public site. ERDC, Education Resource
Data Center.
Data Center, thank you. They report on birth to 21, I believe, school data. And use that for legislative reports. And then some of the data was also from the Annie Casey Foundation, so federal data. So lots of places looking at data, trying to figure out what lessons are learned, how we can be more impactful. So it's important to look at that.
So some good responses coming in. Yes, many more students in foster care are pushed out of school, that is for sure. Sadly, a lot of us who work in this field are not surprised. Foster children are much higher than regular children, that's true. The increase in attendance, yes, we need to dig into why in terms of behaviors of foster children. Using online, could they maintain themselves at the same school? That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
The academic achievement deficit stood out. That doesn't surprise me. Agreed.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, the last piece is, trauma, again, like I said, it looks like a lot of things, and trauma also is not helpful in learning. So students may come in with learning gaps, with disabilities that have not been diagnosed, and it has nothing to do with their intellect or with their wanting to be engaged. Trauma just has a way of kind of stalling things. So really looking into, what's going on with that student, what has been going on with the student, and being an advocate.
And Shannon has a great point. And I think as schools and school staff become more trauma informed, maybe we can get that discipline rate lower, because I think what happens, like Shanna said, these kids are traumatized. Being removed from your parents, no matter what the situation was, is traumatic. Having to live with strangers is traumatic. Having to enroll in a new school is traumatic. And we see that trauma in these really difficult behaviors. And if the adults are seeing that behavior as defiance or, being a bad kid, they're going to get pushed out of school. But if we can get staff to be more trauma informed and see that behavior for what it is, which is it's an unmet need, and look at how we can better support those students rather than kicking them out of school.
All right, everyone. Thank you for your responses. Savannah, can you override me again? Because I don't have a stop share. Thank you.
And there's a question in the chat box from Gabriel. Are foster kids attending online school getting the same benefits as in-person school, though? Good question. Even if their attendance is better, they don't have to change schools as much.
I guess this is Debbie, and I guess I would say that they're not getting the same services as in-person versus virtual. And a lot of our foster youth have individualized education plans, and it's really hard when they're trying to do that virtually to get those minutes and those extra supports that they have a right to. And so that, I think, puts them further and further behind.
Right. And I think we don't want to ever see a scenario where the state decides, oh, if you're in foster care, we're just going to stick you in an online school, because we know what happened during the pandemic when all kids were online. They lost a lot of developmental milestones. They came back to school in 8th grade bodies, but they were still 6th grade kids because they didn't have that practice of being with peers, listening to teachers. And so I think you're right that we can't assume that online is better just in order to keep them in their school of origin. There are a lot of benefits to that in-person learning. And some students may do better online, but we don't want to ever be forcing students in foster care into online just because they're in foster care.
And I think a little farther on, we'll be talking about temporary school plans as well. So there may be times where online is keeping them connected to their school during a temporary move or a temporary situation. So it's really very individual and depends on what that student needs.
Okay, next slide. So that data that we looked at was Washington state data, but it looks similar across the country. Academic outcomes for students in foster care are lower than their peers. So the federal government tried to tackle this issue starting in 2008 with Fostering Connections. And this was or is federal law for child welfare agencies, which really focuses on education. And there's an emphasis on collaborating with schools. However, because of FERPA, the schools were really limited in what information they could share with child welfare. So in 2013, the Uninterrupted Scholars Act was passed. And again, that's on the federal level. And that allows schools to share information with child welfare, even if they don't have authorization from the parent. So it kind of opens up those channels of communication. And then finally, in 2015, they passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, what we call ESSA, and that's federal education law. You'll also notice today that Washington state has codified many of these federal provisions into our own state law. And we'll take a closer look at a couple of them. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a closer look at Fostering Connections. And again, this is federal law for child welfare. And I want you to notice a theme. There's an emphasis on collaboration between child welfare and schools. They talk about educational stability, keeping students in their school of origin, best interest determinations, which we're going to talk about a lot today, and immediate enrollment when it is determined to be in the best interest for a student to change schools. We want them to be enrolled immediately. It's required, it's a federal law. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is a closer look at ESSA. And you'll notice the same things: collaboration with child welfare, making sure students stay in their school of origin, having a best interest determination when a student changes foster care placements. And we also see that immediate enrollment when it is best for a student to enroll in a new school. And there's also a requirement in ESSA for every school district to designate a foster care point of contact. We call them foster care liaisons, and that too is in our state law. Next slide. So school of origin is defined as the school in which the student is enrolled at the time of placement change. And the law is really clear that when there is a placement change, first, there needs to be a best interest determination meeting, which again, we're going to talk about. The law says that that the student must remain in the school of origin unless a best interest determination finds that it's better for them to enroll in the neighborhood school. So if the student moves out of the school's boundary or even out of the district boundary, they have a right to stay at their school of origin. And the school district is required to provide transportation. So that's good for all of you to know with working with these different students that they have a right to stay there. This also applies to preschools that are administered by the district. So if the school district has a preschool program, then this applies, the school of origin applies to those as well. And it also includes designated feeder schools. So if you have a middle school that feeds into a specific high school, when that high school can be considered a school of origin. When the student moves from middle school to high school, they have a right to continue that feed and that pattern. And I want to remind everybody that this is true, that the school of origin rights hold true as long as that child welfare case is open. Next slide. So remember, if a student changes foster care placements, first, there should be a best interest determination. So then if they decide it's in the student's best interest to enroll in the neighborhood school where the student has moved to, the school is required to enroll them immediately. And that means the student should be in school attending class. Sometimes we'll hear the school say, oh yeah, we enrolled them, we've got them on the roster, but we're working on their IEP and it's going to be a couple weeks until we can get them started. That is not in line with the federal law. They are required to get those kids in immediately, even if their IEP needs to be reevaluated. Or the other things that come up are immunizations, like maybe the caseworker doesn't have the proof of immunizations. It does not matter. Federal law and state law both require districts to enroll these students immediately, and that includes attendance. Next slide. Oh, I'm looking at questions in the chat box, and I did say the district is responsible for transportation, and so they do the best interest determination. If they decide it's best for the student to stay in their school of origin, then the school district has to provide that transportation to keep the child in their school of origin. So ideally, those best interest determination meetings would happen prior to the foster care change, the placement change, because the school is required to transport the student to school of origin until that best interest determination meeting has been completed. So yes, and then the department, we'll talk about this a little later too. Well, here it is right here, transportation. The department reimburses school districts for half of those costs associated with additional transportation. So we saw in the federal law that there's this collaboration piece. We see it in both child welfare and education. We wanted to give you some examples of what that collaboration looks like. And best interest determinations, again, is another opportunity for child welfare and schools to collaborate. We have that transportation piece. And I also want everyone to notice that DCYF is responsible for paying outstanding fees and fines. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then districts, we're trying to get the districts to share information with not only the caregiver, but with the social worker. So the social worker should be listed as a contact in that child's, in their student information system. And the social worker should be getting a copy of the report cards or the invite to the IEP meetings. We're really trying to include the actual child welfare system in education. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned that requirement for every school district to designate a foster care liaison, and that's in our state law too. I forgot to mention, we're going to send these slides out so you'll have them. And there's a link on here that takes you to OSPI's website where you can look up the foster care liaison for every district in the state. You can also see on there the DCYF's regional education leads. They're listed on this same site as well. Next slide. So most of you probably already know that DCYF has a state split into 6 regions. This is what they look like. Each region has its own education lead. So like Debbie's here from Region 3, she's the education lead. So if you run into issues around school, you can always reach out to that ed lead for support. And this slide mentions the Cedars foster care report. That's something for school districts. But if we go to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about it. So these are all the ways that school districts identify students in foster care. And that Cedars report comes as a result of a state level data sharing agreement between DCYF and OSPI. So every night, the DCYF computers send a list of school age kids in foster care to OSPI. OSPI matches them up, make sure we have the right student. And then OSPI sends that educational data back to DCYF. And then OSPI also sends out individual district reports to those district foster care liaisons. So that allows the foster care liaison to run a report to see which students in their district are in foster care. And although it's great that we have this, there are some lags and there's some time where kids may not show up on that report. So then we kind of have these backup forms. The caregiver authorization form is the form given to foster parents that allows them to enroll kids in school or take them to the doctor. A lot of times the foster parents will bring those to the school, and then the school sees, oh, they're in foster care. And then the other is a DCYF school notification form. And this is a form that is to be provided to the school anytime a child comes into foster care or they change placement or the case is going to close and they go home. So it's one more way for child welfare to communicate to schools about the status of those kids. Next slide. I'm going to stop here for just a second and see if there are any questions about the federal law. And I'm looking in the chat box. Doesn't look like there's anything. I can't. Anybody have any questions? Okay, I'll keep going. So now we're going to talk about state law. And as I mentioned before, Washington State is unique in that we have codified a lot of those federal foster care provisions into our state law. Stacy's going to talk about the state laws that are on the school side. These that we see right now are state laws on the child welfare side. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint with hyperlinks that will take you directly to that RCW. The other thing I need to note is that many of the RCWs that Stacy and I will cover, they recently changed. And there used to be a lot of different terms used when describing which students are eligible. So some RCWs said students in foster care, some said dependent youth, others said students in out-of-home placements. In fact, you'll see it on these slides because I noticed I haven't updated the slides with the new language, so forgive me. But it's good so you can see what they used to look like. It was kind of all over the board. So last session, Washington passed legislation, it was House Bill 1955, to really clarify which students we're talking about. And the language now reads, and it changed all of these RCWs, it now reads children who are the subject of a dependency proceeding. And the intent here is to ensure that every student involved with child welfare, from the minute they're subject of a shelter care or dependency proceeding, all the way until the case is closed, that they all have these rights to educational stability. And as I said before, this is unique to Washington State because what we've done is codify the federal provisions and we've expanded eligibility to all students with dependency proceedings. And a big portion of kids that we were missing under the federal definition and our old state definitions were students in a trial return home, because they no longer met the federal definition of foster care, so they didn't have the same rights. But now in Washington, we've made it very clear that if there's an open case, that student is eligible. And I'm going to stop and read Nicole's comment. Nicole says, I had a kid who changed schools this fall and they wouldn't let him in until paperwork came in. If this happens again, who would I call to invoke the federal law about immediate enrollment? So Nicole, that would be the district foster care liaison. And here's what I'll say. Sometimes the school building staff, like the secretary or the school counselor, they may not know the law around foster care. The district foster care liaison should know the law about foster care, and it's their job to intervene when a building is saying, oh, you know, we have to have this paperwork before we can get you in class. So at that point, I would reach out directly to that district foster care liaison, go to the OSPI website, look up the district, contact that person. If you get pushback from the foster care liaison, then you would want to elevate it to OSPI, and Stacy Klim would handle that. And her contact information is at the end of this PowerPoint as well. That makes sense? Oh yes, Ryan will help too. Ryan, when I used to work at OSPI, Ryan would contact me a lot and say, we have a school district doing this, and I would intervene. Okay, so let's look at these. Let's look at each one of these. We'll go into the next slide. So we see again that mention of best interest. I'm trying to build anticipation because we're going to talk all about best interest determinations. But this is just like in federal law. We see school of origin rights for students in foster care. School of origin, again, means the school in which the child is enrolled at the time of the placement change. So wherever that student is attending, that's their school of origin. If they move and they do a best interest determination and they decide it's better for the student to enroll in the neighborhood school, then that school becomes their school of origin. Next slide. Here's that best interest determination language again. And again, you can see this slide hasn't been updated because it says in here students in out-of-home care. And all of these have been changed now in the legislature recently to students subject to a dependency proceeding. The law is really clear that there must be a best interest determination prior to changing school placement. So students in foster care should not be enrolled in a new school unless they've done that best interest. And while the law is really clear, we're working really hard on practice in the world. A lot of social workers may be unaware of this law or this requirement. A lot of school buildings, as Nicole found out, they may not be aware. So it's a work in progress. We're getting there, but don't be surprised if you haven't seen this. And what I would say for all of you is if you're working with a student and there's talk of changing the placement, you can bring it up with the social worker and say, hey, I know we're looking at moving this student to a different foster home. Let's do the best interest determination meeting. And that might kind of trigger the social worker to begin that, or it might be an opportunity for you to explain to the social worker what a best interest determination meeting is. Okay, next slide. Again, we see the best interest determinations on this one and collaboration with the school. So the law says we need to discuss and document school placement options and plan necessary school transfers during the FTDM meeting. So that's the family team decision-making meetings. What I will say about this is that we've talked to some of the regions, and it doesn't always work to do the actual best interest meeting at the FTDM. There's a lot of information that schools don't need to know in those meetings. It just may not be a good time, but at those FTDM meetings, they definitely can say, oh, we need to do a best interest determination, and make plans to set up that meeting at some point. Oh, Shanna's just writing. I was just checking to see if there were any questions. So you'll see in this RCW, and again, this is on the child welfare side, it says consistent with the provisions for making best interest determination, which is another RCW, and it's the one we're going to dive deep into in a little bit. And I wanted to note that this is the RCW that requires DCYF to pay school fees and fines. Sometimes people you're working with may not know that that's a requirement. So now you have the RCW and you can help them learn. Next slide. Okay, education liaisons. So in most cases, the educational liaison is the parent. If the parents are not available and the student is in grades 6 through 12, then the department is required to identify an educational liaison. The parents might be unavailable due to incarceration, or maybe parental rights have been terminated. The court might have restricted access between the student and the parent. So in those cases, the department must identify an educational liaison. And ideally, it would be someone who already has a relationship with the student and someone who is willing to really commit to providing that support around education.
Peggy, I want to double click on that just really quickly. We've
Yeah.
been talking throughout this conference. So this is to the advocates. We've been talking throughout this conference about looking for opportunities for a parent to be a parent, even though they may not have custody. Being their education liaison is an absolutely perfect way that you can engage that parent in the act and activity of being a parent. The other thing too, and I think I'm going to push back a little bit, Peggy, on the incarceration piece. I think even if the parent is incarcerated, they can still participate via phone. They can still be the liaison. So don't let
you're
that
right.
be okay.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. That's just some of the reasons that the law cites is like maybe they're unavailable due to incarceration, but I agree 100%. And I think we're getting better at providing opportunities for parents who are incarcerated to participate in school meetings and help make these kinds of decisions. So absolutely. The other thing I want to mention around this issue is that when I was working at OSPI, and I know Stacy will continue this effort, we really focused on making sure schools know that parents still have rights when their student is in foster care. Unless those rights have been terminated by the courts or restricted, those parents should be involved in the best interest determination meetings, in IEP meetings, in school activities. You know, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and you want to work with the social worker to make sure everything's good, but sometimes schools don't know that. So it's good for all of you to know that those parents have rights and they should be included, especially if we're talking about reunifying families. That's not going to be successful if you've blocked the parents from participating in important day-to-day education decisions. So thanks, Ryan, for bringing that up. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it off to Stacy, who is going to tell you about the state laws on the school side.
All right, thank you, Peggy. I did just want to remind everyone what Peggy said, that you're going to get these slides. So for like Nicole, if you want to go back and look at the slide where it directs you to the OSPA website so you can find the foster care liaison, that's all going to be in there. And then you'll notice on these slides, when you see the underlining, like by the RCWs, when you get this PowerPoint, you'll be able to just click on those and that'll take you right to the Washington State Legislature's website where you can actually read the whole entire piece of legislation, the law. So we're going to cover these 6 main areas, although we are not going to cover that second one, best interest determinations, because Debbie's going to cover that in a little bit, as Peggy has got you all excited about it. So we're just going to go down the line through the next few slides and cover them, except for the best interest determination. So next slide, please. So this one is this law is talking about absences, and we talked about that a little bit in the data slides. But one of the big things that we noticed, as you saw on the data slide, that there's a lot of kids in foster care are missing school for one reason or another. So Washington State decided, we need to really monitor these absences, and we want to review them with the key people in the kid's life. So it's not just, the school's getting the data, not doing anything. They're going to be reviewing it with the caseworker and advocates and a foster parent and even the parent. So then that way schools can proactively support the students' schoolwork so they don't fall behind, and that also avoids, suspension and expulsions. This law doesn't outline exactly what to do, but it just says, hey, we've got to work together, we've got to keep track of it, and we got to make sure the student stays on track. Next slide. So we all know how important collaboration and partnerships are, especially when it comes to our kids in foster care. So this is actually the wording from the law. This law is really one sentence, that school districts must collaborate with the Department of, DCYF. And the purpose of that is just to stay in touch with each other and make sure that the student is getting the best outcome. Next slide. So when our foster kids move around, especially our high school kids, you may be in school A and you're taking, an English class, a specific English class, and then you get moved to school B and they don't have that class. And so what happens to all that credit? They're losing credit. So what the legislature found is, these kids are falling behind in their credits also, not just in academic work. So when those credits don't transfer, they want to make sure that these kids are still getting credit for what they're doing. So this law really kind of covers about creating some different means to complete the required casework or similar casework, or even waiving specific courses. So say student A was at school and he had 1 month left of this math class and he got moved to this other school and they don't have that math class. Well, let's look at that and see if we can waive that the new class and use the old class so that he could still get credit for that. So that's what this law is really about, is just figuring out how do we make sure our students are still getting the credit for the work that they do. Next slide. So Peggy already talked about our wonderful foster care liaisons. And so every school district in the country is required to have a foster care liaison, but Washington, who is awesome, took it a step further and said, all right, well, we have foster care liaisons, but wouldn't it be better if we had someone in every school that was really kind of working with these foster kids and knew that they were there and could help them? And so they did that. So they created this law where every school must have a foster care building point of contact. So Nicole, back to your question, when you go in and you have this issue, you could also say, well, can I speak to the foster care building point of contact? Sometimes they might not know who that is, but if they do know who it is, you could talk to them. They should also know the law. And if they're not there, you can't get a hold of them, you can go up to that foster care liaison level. They should also be able to help you. But it's just good to know that inside each school building, there is supposed to be a foster care building point of contact.
Stacy, I wanted to just include, if you're having problems as a court advocate and you're finding that schools are not working with you, the other person you can contact is the DCYF educational program consultant in each of your regions, because we have pretty good relationships with most of the school districts and we can see what's going on.
Debbie, do you have a list of those that you could hand off to us?
They're on the OSPI website where you can look up the district foster care liaisons. You can also see the DCYF ed leads on that same website.
You just have to scroll down to the bottom and you'll see the DCYF leads.
Perfect.
Next slide, please. All right, so there's something between all these state organizations called a DSA, which is a data sharing agreement. And Peggy touched on that a little bit about, transferring those records from DCYF to OSPI, and then OSPI sends them back. And that's what this one is about. This one's about when we send it back, the DCYF is then authorized to share those records with those who need that educational information. It could be, a foster parent, a guardian, or if this child's in residential care. Those records are then available to those individuals so that they know where that student is at and what needs they may have. Sometimes, I will say, as a former foster parent, these things sometimes fall through the cracks. You don't always get all of the information. And if you don't, just keep calling the caseworker until they get it, because eventually they'll have it and hopefully can share it with you. But this education piece, which is why all of you are here, is really important. We really need to make sure that, these kids stay in school, because that may be the only stability they have in their life. So we want to make sure the people who are in their lives and taking care of them and looking out for them have the most accurate information so they can really help them succeed in school. Next slide. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. I want to add that this is, I mentioned this before, this is a work in progress. Historically, child welfare in schools have not had the strongest relationship, if there even was a relationship. And so it can be a challenge to get schools and child welfare to collaborate. I see all of you as key players in that collaboration. You can encourage it on both sides, and we all have to give each other some grace as people get used to these new laws.
Yeah. All right, next slide. It's break time.
Before we go to break, are there any questions? And you can feel free to unmute and just shout out, or you can put it in the chat box. Anybody have any weird situations related to school that you want to ask about or tell us about?
Hi, this is Ryan. I'm one of the ed leads in Region 3, or going to be taking over for Debbie. And I'm curious if the department identifies an educational liaison, right, for a child to the school, is it then the school's responsibility to reach out to that liaison to support, or is it the department's responsibility? Like, who makes that connection when we have a parent that's absent, but we have someone that could stand in place until that parent returns?
That's a great question, Ryan. And I would say it's the department's responsibility to designate the educational liaison, and then to give that information to the school. And then the school is responsible for making sure that person has all the information they need. That person should have access to school records. They should be included in IEP meetings, because that person is the designated decision maker. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And then the second part of that question is, does it have to be court ordered, or can it just be identified and accepted?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yes, it has to be court ordered because there is a checkbox on the court order forms for all of these things for the education decision maker. So yes, so that would be the other thing that would have to happen too, is that you'd have to get file a motion to get that done, and your AG should know how to do that.
The department makes recommendations who that might be, but that's also another place where a court advocate might have some input. They might know that there's an aunt that's really involved or that would like to be, or someone in that family that has that relationship. So it is the department makes a recommendation, best, guess based on just the information they have. And hopefully they're also involving that youth and asking them who they'd like to stand up for them. But then, yes, it is a court appointed process and it should be reviewed at every hearing. But again, that's somewhere as an advocate, you can say, hey, are we talking about education at every court hearing?
Yeah, and again, advocates, just so you know that if you do get that, like it comes through, or that motion is filed, and you think, wait, that's not the right one, let your program know so that we can respond to that motion properly and get that information before the court so that the court can make that final determination. It's not the department, it's the court that makes these decisions.
There's a question in the chat box from Betty. Are services for a child in one school then required to be provided at another school that child may attend? And Betty, are you talking about like special education services? And what I will say is that if a student is receiving special education services, they have an IEP that will oh, go ahead.
No, I know about the IEP. I was thinking about beyond the IEP. Like if they're receiving, for instance, reading assistance or anything like that, is that something that, and it may be outside an IEP, is that required that the next school also look into that?
Well, I think it would be great information for the next school to have. And that's part of this, what makes this hard. They should talk about that in the best interest determination meeting too. Like what services are being provided to the student at this school? Are those same services available at this other school? That might be a factor in determining which school would better serve the student. And there's not a requirement unless it's in the IEP, but I think schools want to meet students' needs. They just have to have the information. They have to know, oh, we had a reading tutor set up on once a week, and I think they'll do their best, but it wouldn't be necessarily required.
Okay, thank you.
The 504 plan. Yeah, the 504 plan would be required, that anything in a 504 plan or IEP. Okay, we are going to take a break, and we decided that since this is 3 hours, we would do a 10-minute break. So we're giving you all 10 minutes. You can maybe get in a quick walk around the block, unless it's pouring down rain where you are, or get a snack or do a little yoga. I don't know, whatever you need to do to keep yourself refreshed and energized. We will come back at 2:18. We don't have any break music or chickens to look at, so I'll just put it in the chat box. Oh, Stacy put it in there. We'll be back.